Since the 1970s, the Beirut grain silos have marked the seam between the city and the sea. Ships from the Soviet Union and later on Russia and Ukraine, loaded with barley, corn, and wheat, docked in the port to unload the vital food staples. 42 concrete cylinders with a capacity to store up to 120,000 tons of grain guaranteed Lebanon's food security. This much grain is enough to make bread for up to 1,700,000 people for a year. The Beirut port explosion on August 4, 2020, ripped through the city, destroying 70,000 homes and much of the port area. Over 300,000 people were left homeless. The epicenter of the blast was only 75 meters away from these silos. The shock waves tore apart 28 of the 42 silos. 9 workers were in the structure at the time of the blast. Dispersed between broken concrete and spilled grains, their remains, never found, were entangled in the ruins. The site, both a crime scene and a graveyard, was cordoned off. Access was controlled by the government, itself accused of sharing in the responsibility for the blast. Behind the cordon, the site was constantly worked upon. On July 7, 2022, almost 2 years after the blast, a fire became visible at the base of the silos. That fire led to the destruction of what had remained of the north part of the silos. The collapse of the northern silos happened in 3 stages. The first one on July 31st, then August 4th, and August 23rd. The second stage of the collapse occurred on the 2nd-year anniversary of the Beirut port explosion.
نحن بعدنا ب4 آب. 4 آب بعد ما خلص.
بالنسبة للإعراءات اللي عم تقلب، هذه طمس للحقيقة.
قالوا لنا 5 أيام وعدونا يطلعوا التحقيقات. هاي صار لنا 2 بعد لهلا ما شفنا شيء من التحقيق.
Threading together videos, images, and published research, Febrayer partnered with forensic architecture to create a unified account of the gradual destruction of a ruin. The destruction of destruction. For some, the silo ruins call up the persistent lack of accountability in the August 4 tragedy, and yet it also looms on the horizon of the city as a constant reminder of what happened to the inhabitants of Beirut. We obtained some of the earliest drone footage of the silos taken a day after the explosion on August 5th.
تحولت الوظيفة المادية لما تبقى من هذا المبنى إلى رمز ثابت في وجدان وذاكرة أهالي الضحايا وعموم اللبنانيات واللبنانيين، وشاهد على جريمة لم يكشف عن مرتكبيها بعد.
We used this footage to develop an accurately measurable 3D model through which isolated research and open-source documentation about the silos collapse can be brought into conversation. On July 13, 2022, 6 days after it began, the fire, fueled by the fermented grain, expanded to an area of approximately 250 square meters. While the state had cordoned off entry to the silos, thereby obstructing any public inquiry, the fire exceeded any state of occlusion, and residents in Beirut watched from a distance. The Lebanese army's response, which came on July 16, 9 days after the first fire became visible, rapidly cooled the structure. On July 21st, 5 days later, the fermented grains dried up and caught fire again. According to fire engineers at Kindling, a non-profit dedicated to fire safety, the change in temperature caused by a fire could lead to the collapse of a concrete structure. Another attempt at cooling down the base of the silos was carried out by the Lebanese armed forces and the fire brigade. Rapid cooling could also have contributed to the collapse of the silos. On July 31st, after 24 days of intermittent fires, the first collapse took place. The same authorities responsible for the blast were again negligent in preventing a fire waiting to happen. A comparison between our models of the silos on August 5, 2020 and February 3, 2021 reveals that while the authorities removed much of the spilled grains, they failed to remove all of them. Some 10,000 tons were left exposed at the base of the towers. Exposed to rainwater, the grains fermented, causing a temperature increase. At 100 degrees, small local fires, many of them invisible, could have caught fire. According to Emmanuel Durand, an engineer monitoring the structure, fires could have already started as early as December 2020. On the backside of the structure, authorities drilled large holes to empty the fermented grains from the silo and avert a fire. But these openings did not adhere to expert specifications that recommend circular holes. Cracks started spreading from the irregular openings, sharp corners, gradually moving along the concrete structure's lines of least resistance. After the second collapse on August 4, 2022, the cracks expanded until they had connected all of the holes, before spreading to the adjacent columns where holes had not been drilled. Emmanuel Durand and St. Joseph University published 2 reports to measure the tilt of the remaining silos. In September 2020, a month after the August 4 blast, most of the remaining silos were tilting by up to 25 centimeters away from the crater. However, 2 months later, in November 2020, they were recorded tilting at an average of 3 centimeters in the other direction toward the crater. As a sizable portion of the land on which the silos sat before the explosion had lost ground to the crater, there was nothing to anchor them any longer. In April 2021, the tilt of the south silos stabilized, while the tilt of the north silos increased rapidly in the direction of the crater. The severe tilt was recorded shortly after the drilling of the holes at the base of the silos. By March 2022, a year later, the speed of tilt had decreased, but rapid changes in temperature from the July 2022 fire completed the collapse. The fall of the silos was triggered by a combination of factors, met with questionable actions by the authorities against best practice. This destruction of destruction, an explicit denial of remembrance and evidence, echoes the practice of occlusion that binds the still ongoing investigations into the August 4 explosion. By preserving the ruins as a digital archive, this work counters the state's prevailing logic of erasure and seeks to create a space for people to decide how they want to relate to the site and its histories.